There is a particular kind of quiet that arrives after an empath stops explaining, and it is not the quiet of defeat. It is not the quiet of someone who has run out of things to say, or who has been argued into submission, or who has finally accepted a version of events they never believed. It is something entirely different, and the avoidant on the other side of it recognizes the difference immediately, even though they will not be able to name what they are recognizing. They have heard your silence before. They have heard the silence that came after an argument, the one that was full of held breath and waiting, the one that was really just a pause in an ongoing negotiation. They know that silence intimately because they created most of it. They know its texture, its duration, and most importantly, they know how it ends, which is with you speaking first, softening first, reaching first, offering the bridge that gets both of you back across. This silence does not have that shape. There is nothing waiting inside it. And the absence of waiting is the single most disorienting thing an avoidant person can encounter, because their entire method of relating depends on the existence of someone who waits. You did not choose this silence as a tactic. That is the part that makes it powerful, and it is also the part that makes it impossible to fake. You arrived at it. You arrived at it after years of being the only person in the relationship who is willing to say the hard thing out loud, after thousands of hours of translation work, after an exhausting and finally unbearable period of being the sole author of every difficult conversation that ever happened between you. You did not go quiet to teach them something. You went quiet because you had reached the end of what one person can say into a room that does not answer, and yet the silence teaches. It teaches more in 3 weeks than 4 years of explanation ever managed, not because it is a superior technique, but because it is the first honest thing the relationship has contained in a very long time. Why you talked so much in the first place? Before understanding the power of the silence, you have to understand the words, because the words were not weakness, and calling them weakness will keep you from seeing what you actually did. You talked because you were trying to build something, and words are the only material available for building relationships. That is not a metaphor. Intimacy is constructed out of stated things. Two people become close by saying what they feel, naming what they want, describing what hurt, articulating what they hope for, and then adjusting based on what the other person says back. That is the entire mechanism. There is no other one. So when you found yourself with someone who did not produce those materials, you compensated. You supplied both halves. You said your feeling, and then you also supplied the interpretation of their non-response. You named your want, and then you also constructed the generous reading of their deflection. You described what hurt, and then, receiving nothing, you explained to yourself why the nothing was not what it appeared to be. That was not chattering. That was load-bearing labor. You were holding up a structure that required 2 people to hold up, and you were doing it alone, and you did it for years, and the reason you talked so much is that talking was the only tool you had for keeping the thing standing. Consider the specific things you said, not once, dozens of times in dozens of formulations, across dozens of months. You explained that you needed more consistency. You explained it gently the first time, and then more directly the 5th time, and then with examples the 20th time, and then with a kind of exhausted precision the 50th time, and each time you refined the language a little further because you had concluded that the problem must be the delivery. If you could just find the phrasing that landed. If you could just explain it in a way that did not trigger the defense. If you could just be clear enough, calm enough, unaccusatory enough, you were searching for a key. And the search was rational because in almost every other domain of life, clearer explanation does produce better understanding. You were applying a principle that works nearly everywhere. In the one place it does not work at all, because the problem was never comprehension. They understood you the first time. They understood you the 3rd time and the 10th time and the 50th. What was happening was not a failure to receive the message. It was a nervous system that responded to the message with a threat signal, and threat signals do not resolve through further clarity. They resolve through distance. So every time you explained more clearly, you increased the fidelity of the thing that was activating the defense, and the defense responded exactly as it was designed to, which is by moving away. You were not failing to communicate. You were communicating with escalating precision to a system that experiences precise communication as danger, the moment the words ran out. Everyone who lives through this has a specific moment when the talking stops, and it is worth locating yours, because the moment is more significant than it felt at the time. It usually does not arrive as a decision. It arrives as an inability. You open your mouth to say the thing you have said 100 times, and the words are simply not available. Not because you are angry, not because you are withholding, but because some part of you has finally run the calculation and returned a result, and the result is that saying it again will produce the identical outcome, and producing the identical outcome one more time is not something you can spend energy on. that moment feels like giving up. It is filed in most people's memory under the day I stopped trying, and that filing is wrong and it should be corrected because what actually happened was not surrender. It was the completion of an experiment. You had been testing a hypothesis for years. The hypothesis was that sufficient clarity would produce change. You tested it under a wide variety of conditions, with many different formulations at different times of day, in different emotional registers, after good periods and bad ones. That is an unusually rigorous test, and the test returned a clear negative, and you stopped, and stopping when the data is conclusive is not defeat. It is the correct response to information. The reason it feels like defeat is that in a healthy relationship, running out of words would be a catastrophe. Words are how it works, so a part of you registered the silence as the death of the connection, and it was right about that, and it was wrong to interpret the death as something you caused. What actually killed the connection was the 4 years of unanswered words that preceded the silence. The silence was just the moment you noticed, what the avoidant hears when you stop. Now here is where it gets interesting, because the thing you experienced as an ending, they experience as something else entirely, and the gap between the two experiences is enormous. For the entire relationship, your words were performing a function for them that they were not aware of. They were absorbing pressure. Every time you named a problem, the naming released a small amount of the tension in the system, and the release meant the tension never accumulated to a level they had to feel. You were the pressure valve. You would voice the dissatisfaction, they would deflect it, and the deflection would resolve the immediate moment, and the underlying issue would remain but would remain quiet. That process kept the relationship in a stable and slightly uncomfortable equilibrium for years. It was uncomfortable for you and merely slightly uncomfortable for them, which is exactly the distribution that makes such arrangements last. When you stop speaking, the valve closes, and the pressure that used to get released in small increments now has nowhere to go, and it does not disappear because the underlying conditions have not changed. It accumulates inside them for the first time. That is the mechanism, not that your silence hurts them, that your silence stops protecting them from something that was always there. What they experience is not primarily the loss of your voice. It is the sudden arrival of a sensation they have never had to hold, which is the unrelieved awareness that something is wrong and that nobody is going to come and describe it for them and thereby make it manageable. Because that is what your naming did. It made things manageable. When you said the problem out loud, the problem became a bounded object with edges, something that could be responded to or deflected or set aside. Unnamed, it is not an object, it is a weather system. It is a diffuse and objectless wrongness that permeates everything and cannot be located, and diffuse objectless wrongness is precisely the thing that avoidant strategies are worst at handling, because there is nothing to withdraw from. You cannot create distance from a fog. The difference between silence and withholding. It matters enormously that you understand what you are doing, because there is a version of quiet that is a move in the game and a version that is an exit from the game, and only one of them produces anything worth having. Withholding is a communication. It is speech performed through absence. It says something specific, which is I am upset with you and I want you to notice and come find me and fix it. It has a target audience and an intended effect and a desired response, and it is monitored for results. A person who is withholding checks. They check whether the message was received. They calibrate the duration based on the other person's reaction. They are in every meaningful sense still talking, just in a different medium. Withholding is exhausting in exactly the way that talking was exhausting, because it is still your energy going into managing their experience. You have simply changed instruments. What you have arrived at, if you have arrived at it, is different. It is not addressed to anyone. It is not monitored for effect. It has no intended duration because it is not a period. It is a condition. You are not being quiet at them. You have simply stopped producing output in a direction that was never returning anything, and the redirected energy has gone somewhere else, and the somewhere else is your own life. The avoidant can tell the difference. This is the part people find hard to believe, and it is nonetheless true, not consciously. They could not articulate the distinction, but their entire threat detection apparatus is finely calibrated to sense whether someone is oriented toward them or not, because that orientation is what they have spent their life managing, and they register quickly whether your silence has them in it. Withholding silence contains them. They feel that, and the feeling is uncomfortable, and it is also familiar, and familiar discomfort is something they know how to wait out. They will simply outlast it. That is the one thing they are unambiguously better at than you. The other silence does not contain them at all, and what they feel in the presence of that one is not discomfort. It is a kind of vertigo, because they have oriented their position in the relationship relative to your attention, and your attention has moved, and there is now nothing to be positioned against. Why words were always the weaker instrument. There is a structural reason that verbal engagement fails against avoidance, and once you see it, you will stop mourning all those conversations you never got to have. Words operate in the domain of understanding. Avoidance operates in the domain of regulation. These are different systems in the body, and they run on different logic, and they do not have a direct connection. Understanding is cortical. It is slow, verbal, capable of nuance, responsive to evidence. It is the part of a person that can hear a well-constructed explanation and think, yes, that is accurate, I do that. Avoidant people frequently have excellent access to this system. Many of them can describe their own patterns fluently. Some of them have read about attachment theory and can name their style and discuss it with insight. They can agree with you completely and mean it. Regulation is subcortical. It is fast, wordless, indifferent to evidence, and it activates before the cortical system has finished processing. When intimacy approaches a certain threshold, the regulatory system fires a threat response, and the threat response produces withdrawal, and it does all of this in under a second, well before any of the excellent understanding upstairs has been consulted. So you can win the argument completely and lose the outcome entirely. You can produce agreement and change nothing. You have probably experienced this exact sequence, possibly many times. A conversation that felt like a breakthrough, real emotion, genuine acknowledgement, a sense that finally something had gotten through, and then within 3 days the identical behavior as though the conversation had not occurred. The conversation did occur. It just occurred in a part of the person that does not control the behavior. This is why words are the weaker instrument here. Not because you were saying the wrong things and not because you lacked eloquence. Because you were operating in a channel that is not connected to the mechanism you were trying to affect. Silence is different, and the reason it is different is not mystical. Silence operates in the regulatory domain. It is not an argument. It does not require processing. It is a change in the environment, registered directly by the nervous system, in the same fast, wordless channel where the avoidance itself lives. You have moved from a channel they can deflect into a channel they cannot. The empath's particular disadvantage in conversation. You should also understand why you specifically lost every one of those verbal exchanges, because it was not a fair fight, and you have probably been blaming yourself for the outcome of a rigged contest. You have a feature that made you excellent at loving and terrible at negotiating with this particular kind of person. You feel the other person's distress in your own body. That is not a figure of speech. When you are sitting across from someone who is becoming overwhelmed, your own system registers it physiologically and produces a matching state. Their discomfort becomes your discomfort. Their rising defensiveness becomes your rising anxiety. And your anxiety generates an urgent motivation to reduce the distress in the room, which you accomplish the fastest way available, which is by softening whatever you were saying that produced it. So in every difficult conversation, there was a moment, usually about 90 seconds in, where you began to feel their state and started to accommodate it. You would qualify, you would add a reassurance. You would say something like, but I know you have been under a lot of pressure, or I am not saying this is all your fault, or maybe I am being too sensitive. And with each of those additions, the actual content of what you were saying diluted, until by the end of the conversation you had substantially retracted your own position without ever intending to. They did not have to defeat you. You retreated on your own, driven by an involuntary response to their discomfort, and the retreat happened so smoothly that both of you experienced it as the conversation naturally resolving. That is why the words never worked. Not because they were the wrong words, but because you were incapable of delivering them at full strength to a person who was visibly distressed by them, and they were reliably visibly distressed by them, and their distress was, whether or not they knew it, the most effective possible defense against you specifically. Silence has none of that vulnerability. There is no live feedback loop. There is no face across the table producing a state in your body that you then have to manage. There is nothing to soften because nothing is being said. The empathic override cannot activate because there is no real-time input for it to respond to. That is the actual source of the power, not that silence is a superior weapon. That silence is the only medium in which you are not automatically disarmed. What happens in the first 2 weeks? The early period follows a recognizable arc, and knowing it will keep you from misreading the signals. In the first several days, they will likely feel relief. It is important to hear this now, calmly, rather than discovering it later and being wounded by it. Relief is the automatic response of an avoidant nervous system to the reduction of relational demand. It is not a verdict on your worth or on the depth of what you had. It is autonomic, like a shoulder dropping when a weight is removed. It happens on its own, and it means nothing about love. In the same period, they may become more pleasant. This surprises people. The absence of pressure allows their system to settle, and a settled, avoidant person is often warm, engaging, easy. You may find them suddenly more available in small ways, a message about nothing, a moment of unexpected softness. If you're still in proximity, they may seem briefly like the person you first met. That is not progress. That is the pattern operating exactly as designed. Availability increases as demand decreases, and it will decrease again the moment demand returns. This is the single most common trap in the entire dynamic, and it catches nearly everyone because it produces a sequence of experience that is almost impossible not to misinterpret. You stop asking for things, they become nicer, and you conclude that the problem was your asking. The problem was not your asking. The problem is a system that can only offer warmth in the absence of requirement, which means the warmth is real, and it is also permanently conditional on your not needing anything. Around the end of the second week, something shifts. The relief has been fully banked and has stopped producing pleasure, the way any relief does. And into the space where the relief was, the first unease begins to arrive. It is not conscious yet. It presents as a vague sense that something is unresolved. They may find themselves checking something, rereading an old message, noticing that a certain sound in the apartment now has nothing on the other end of it. They will not connect this to you yet. That connection takes considerably longer, and it is the part that avoidant wiring specifically disrupts. The third week and the first reach. Somewhere in the third or fourth week, in most cases, there is a reach, and you need to know its anatomy because it will look like more than it is. The reach is almost never direct. It arrives disguised as something incidental. A practical matter that could plausibly require attention, a question about a shared acquaintance, a link to something you would have found funny, occasionally something more transparent, a message that says thinking of you or hope you are well, delivered without follow-through. What the incidental frame does is preserve deniability, and the deniability is the whole reason for the frame. If they ask directly and you decline, they have been rejected, and rejection is intolerable. If they ask incidentally and you decline, nothing has happened because nothing was asked, so the reach is really a measurement. They are testing whether the field is still there, whether you are still oriented toward them. Whether the silence is the withholding kind, which would mean they still occupy the center of your attention and the situation is retrievable, or the other kind, which would mean something has genuinely changed. Understand what they are hoping to find. They are not hoping to reconcile. Reconciliation would reinstate exactly the conditions that made them uncomfortable. What they are hoping to find is that your attention is still available while your demand remains suspended. That is the ideal configuration for an avoidant person, and it is why the reach so often comes with no proposal attached. There is no plan being offered. There is only a check. If you respond warmly, you have confirmed availability and the system stabilizes, not into a better relationship. Into a lower-cost version of the same one, where they now know that the absence of your voice is temporary and survivable, and that if they wait it out, you come back. If you do not respond, something happens that is genuinely new for them. The measurement returns a null result, not a negative one, a null one. There is no data. And a nervous system that has organized itself around monitoring another person's attention cannot process an absence of signal. It will keep querying. That querying is what you may hear about later as them thinking about you constantly, and it is worth knowing that it is not longing exactly. It is a monitoring process that cannot terminate because it is not receiving the input it needs to close. Why you should not enjoy this. There is a version of this material that turns into a revenge fantasy, and it is worth stepping on that now firmly, because it will cost you months if you let it grow. Everything described above will happen, or something close to it, and the temptation is to organize your recovery around watching it happen, to check, to ask mutual friends, to construct a mental timeline of their unraveling, and to derive daily comfort from imagining what stage they are currently in. The moment you do that, the silence stops working, not for them, for you. Because a silence that is being maintained in order to produce an effect is not silence. It is a strategy, and strategies require monitoring, and monitoring means your attention is still pointed at them, which means you are still doing the work, which means you have not actually left. You have simply moved the relationship inside your own head, where it now runs at all hours without the inconvenience of the other person being present. That is a worse arrangement than the one you exited. At least the old one had company. There's also a practical problem with the revenge frame, which is that it makes you dependent on their reaction. If your piece requires them to suffer appropriately, then you have handed them one final piece of control, because they may not suffer on your schedule or visibly, or at all in a way you can verify. And then you are stuck waiting for a confirmation that may never come, which is exactly the waiting posture you were trying to leave. The silence is not a punishment. It is not even primarily about them. It is what happens when a person stops spending energy in a direction that does not return anything. Every framing that makes it about their experience relocates the center of your life back to where it was. Let the effects happen. Do not attend them. The sound of a room without you managing it. To understand what your absence does, you have to understand what your presence was doing, and the honest inventory is longer than you think. You were running a continuous interpretation service. When they were short with you, you supplied the explanation. When they canceled, you constructed the version where it was understandable. When they said something dismissive about something you loved, you found the reading in which it was not dismissive. This service ran automatically, and it ran so fast that you frequently did not notice you were doing it. By the time the raw event reached your conscious mind, it had already been processed into a more acceptable form. That service was not only for you, it was for both of you. Because your processed version was the one that then governed how you behaved, and how you behaved was what they experienced, which means they were living in a version of the relationship that your interpretation had made livable. They never saw the raw version of their own behavior. You intercepted it before it landed and handed back the softened one. Now the service is closed. And the consequence is not that they are being punished. The consequence is that they are, possibly for the first time in the entire relationship, encountering the unprocessed record of what they did. The cancellation is now just a cancellation. The 4 days of silence, which used to arrive to them wrapped in your generous account of their need for space, is now just 4 days of silence with nothing attached. The dismissive comment is just a dismissive comment. Without your reframing, the material reads very differently, and they are the only one available to read it, and they are not good at reading. This is the actual power in the situation, and it is worth being precise about why it is not a manipulation. You are not doing anything to them. You have stopped doing something for them. Those are categorically different acts, and the fact that the second one produces a dramatic effect is only evidence of how much the first one was carrying. A person does not notice a service until it stops. That is not the service's fault, what your voice was costing you. Enough about their side. The reason the silence matters is what it does for you, and that is the part that gets least attention because it is less dramatic. Every one of those conversations cost you something specific and non-renewable. Not just time and not just energy. It cost you contact with your own position. Here is how. You would go into a conversation holding a clear internal sense of what had happened and how you felt about it. Over the course of the exchange, under the pressure of their discomfort and their deflections and their alternative account, that clear sense would erode. You would come out the other side less certain than you went in, not persuaded exactly, just fogged. And the fog would take days to lift, and often before it had fully lifted, the next incident would occur and the cycle would restart. Over years, this produces a specific injury. You lose reliable access to your own read on things. You become a person who has to check, who has to run their perception past someone else, who cannot fully trust a conclusion until it has been externally validated. That is not a personality trait you were born with. That is the residue of thousands of hours of having your accurate perception met with an alternative account delivered by someone whose comfort you were physically compelled to protect. The silence stops the erosion. Immediately. That is the first thing you get, and it arrives faster than any of the other benefits. Within 2 or 3 weeks of not having those conversations, people consistently report the same thing, which is that their read gets clear. Not gradually, almost abruptly. Things they had been uncertain about for years suddenly resolve into obviousness, not because they learned anything new, but because the fogging process stopped and the fog dissipated on its own. That clarity is the actual win. Everything else is secondary. You have your perception back, uncontested, and it is more accurate than you have allowed yourself to know. The empath's silence is not the avoidant's silence. There is an important distinction here, because you may worry that you are becoming what you left. Their silence was a withdrawal from contact. It removed them from the field while leaving you in it, still oriented toward them, still working. It was a move within the relationship, deployed to manage their internal state, and it always ended when their internal state had settled enough to permit return. It was a cycle, not a position. Yours is not a withdrawal from contact. It is a withdrawal from a specific unreciprocated labor. The difference shows up in how you are with everyone else. An avoidant person in a withdrawal phase is generally less available across the board because the system is in threat mode, and threat mode does not discriminate. An empath who has stopped explaining to one specific person is frequently more available everywhere else, sometimes dramatically so, because an enormous amount of capacity has just been released. Check yourself against that. If your silence has made you warmer with friends, more present at work, more interested in things, then it is the healthy kind. If it has made you generally colder and more guarded and less reachable by anyone, then something else is happening, and that something else is usually unprocessed grief wearing the costume of strength, and it will need attention. There is also a difference in what the silence is protecting. Theirs protected them from being known. Yours protects you from spending yourself on someone who will not spend anything back. One is a defense against intimacy. The other is a defense of resources. They can look similar from outside, and they feel completely different from inside. You will know which one you are in by asking a simple question. If the right person walked in tomorrow and offered real contact, would you be able to receive it? If the answer is yes, or even probably, you are fine. The silence is doing its job. If the answer is a flat no, the silence has become something else, and it is worth looking at. The things you will want to say and should not. There is a specific message that composes itself in your head, usually somewhere between week 3 and week 6, and it is worth describing precisely so that you recognize it when it arrives. It is comprehensive. It lays everything out. It has structure, possibly sections. It contains examples with approximate dates. It anticipates their objections and answers them preemptively. It is calm in tone, which is the most seductive feature, because the calmness makes it feel like an act of maturity rather than an act of unfinished business. It ends with something like, "I do not need a response," which is not true, and you know it is not true even as you write it. That message is the entire argument you were never allowed to complete, finally assembled with no one interrupting. It is a genuine work of understanding. It is also the last piece of the old labor, and sending it would be spending the final reserve of your energy on the same person who never returned any of it. Do not send it, but do write it. That distinction matters more than the prohibition. Write the whole thing, take as long as it takes. Put in every example, every pattern, every moment you swallowed. Get it all out of your body and into a document. The compulsion is not irrational. There is genuinely something in you that needs to be discharged, and refusing to discharge it does not make it go away. It makes it circulate. Then keep it. Do not send it, do not delete it dramatically, just keep it. Read it in 3 months. What you will notice on that reading is that the person who wrote it was still trying to be understood by someone specific, and that the version of you reading it no longer requires that, and the gap between those two people is the measure of your recovery. The reason the message cannot be sent is not that they do not deserve to hear it. It is that the sending would reopen a channel that has been closed, and the reopening would give them the one thing they need to stabilize, which is evidence that your attention is still available. A comprehensive message about how deeply they hurt you is, from the perspective of their nervous system, an enormous reassurance. It says you are still there. It says the connection persists. It converts a null result into a positive one. The silence says nothing, and nothing is the only thing they cannot metabolize. The long middle period. Between the early phase and the arrival of actual peace, there is a long stretch that nobody prepares you for, and it is the part where most people break the silence, so it deserves detailed attention. It is not dramatic. That is what makes it hard. The acute pain has receded and has been replaced by something flatter and more persistent, a low-grade absence. The specific dullness of a life that has had a large occupying force removed from it and has not yet filled the space with anything else. In this period, you will find yourself thinking about them at odd times without any accompanying emotion, just the thought, arriving unattached. That is not a sign that you are still in love. It is the residue of a habit. You spent years with a background process dedicated to tracking one person, and the process does not shut down when the person leaves. It keeps running, querying an address that no longer returns anything, and each query surfaces as a thought. The queries decrease, slowly and unevenly. There will be weeks where they nearly stop, and then a week where they spike for no discernible reason, and the spike will feel like regression and is not. Nothing about this process is linear, and the nonlinearity is not a sign that you are doing it wrong. What makes this period dangerous is the absence of a clear reason not to reach out. In the acute phase, the reason is obvious. The wound is fresh and you know contact would reopen it. In the middle period, the wound is no longer fresh and the memory has softened, and the case against contact becomes abstract. You will find yourself thinking that it would probably be fine, that enough time has passed, that you're strong enough now to have a conversation without being pulled back in. You may even be right about the last part. That is what makes it convincing. But the question is not whether you could survive the contact. The question is what the contact would be for. And if you sit with that question honestly, the answer is almost always that you want to find out whether they have realized anything, which means you are still waiting for the account, which means the loop is still open, which means the contact would extend it rather than close it. Get through this period by making it boring rather than heroic. Do not treat every day of silence as a triumph of will, because framing it as an achievement keeps it in the foreground and things in the foreground stay alive. The goal is for the silence to become uninteresting, to stop being a policy and start being a fact. That transition happens through repetition and time and through your attention being occupied elsewhere, and it cannot be accelerated by determination. The real meaning of winning here. The word winning is in the title, and it needs to be handled honestly, because there is a shallow version of it that will lead you nowhere. The shallow version is that you win by producing more suffering in them than they produced in you, by being the one who is fine while they are not, by constructing an outcome in which they lose. That version is available, and it is emotionally satisfying in the short term, and it has a fatal structural flaw, which is that it makes your victory conditional on their state. If winning requires them to be devastated, then you cannot win alone, and you have to keep watching to confirm the score, and the watching is the loss. The real version is simpler and considerably less satisfying at first. You win when the thing that was being taken from you stops being taken. That is the whole definition. The relationship was extracting something from you continuously, and now it is not, and the extraction has stopped whether or not the other party ever notices, ever suffers, ever understands, or ever thinks about you again. That is a victory that does not require a second participant, which means it is one you can actually complete. And the reason silence is the instrument of it is not that silence hurts them. It is that silence is what the cessation of extraction looks like from the outside. You are pouring words into a vessel with no bottom. The silence is simply what the room sounds like when a person stops pouring. The effect it has on them is real, and it is a side effect. It is not the point, and it should not become the point, because the moment it becomes the point, you have picked the vessel back up. There is one more layer to this. The reason it feels like winning, subjectively, when it finally lands, has nothing to do with them at all. It is the sensation of your own energy returning to you. You have had a substantial percentage of your available life force committed elsewhere for years, and it comes back, and the coming back is a physical experience. People describe it as feeling lighter, or as things being brighter, or as suddenly being interested in something they had forgotten they liked. That is the win. It arrives in your own body, and it does not check anyone else's status. Why they cannot win this one. There is an asymmetry here that runs entirely in your favor, and it is worth understanding structurally rather than as a comforting idea. Their entire strategy depends on the existence of a pursuer. Everything they do is a maneuver relative to someone who is coming closer. The withdrawal is a move away from an approach. The vagueness is a defense against a request. The intermittent warmth is a management technique for someone who is invested. Every tool in the kit assumes a counterpart who is oriented toward them. Remove the counterpart and the kit becomes inoperative, not defeated. Inoperative. There is a difference, and the difference is why this feels so strange to them. They have not lost an argument. They have not been outmaneuvered. They have simply arrived at a situation in which none of their moves have anywhere to land. Withdrawal from someone who is already at a distance is not withdrawal. It is just distance. Vagueness delivered to someone who is not asking a question is not vagueness. It is silence, and now they are the ones producing it into a void. Intermittent warmth offered to someone who does not respond to it is not a reinforcement schedule. It is just a message that goes unanswered. You have not beaten them. You have exited the field on which they are competent. This is also why the pull to re-engage is so strong for them, and why the reaches keep coming from people who genuinely have no intention of changing anything. It is not always about wanting you back. Frequently it is about restoring a configuration in which their abilities function. A person who is very good at one specific game will keep trying to restart that game, not out of malice, but because it is the only one they know how to play. Your silence does not need to defeat them. It needs only to not restart the game. What happens to the empath who keeps talking? For contrast, and because it is worth knowing what you avoided, consider the trajectory of the person who does not stop. They escalate, not into aggression usually, but into precision. The explanations become more detailed, better organized, more thoroughly documented. They start keeping records without quite admitting that is what they are doing. Screenshots, notes about dates, a private accumulation of evidence for a case that will never be heard by any tribunal. Then they begin outsourcing. They tell friends the story in increasing detail, hoping that the friends' agreement will somehow transmit. They read constantly about attachment styles, and each article feels like a revelation, and none of the revelations change anything because the problem was never a shortage of understanding on their end. Then they begin to fragment. The gap between what they know and what they are doing becomes untenable. They can articulate the entire dynamic with textbook precision and remain inside it, and the ability to describe a cage you are still in produces a specific kind of self-contempt that is more corrosive than the original wound. And then, usually, they get quieter anyway, but for the wrong reason. Not because they chose to stop, but because they broke. The words run out through exhaustion rather than decision, and the silence that follows is depleted rather than clear, and it takes far longer to recover from. You are not in that trajectory, or you are exiting it. The distinction matters because the two silences look identical from outside and produce entirely different people on the other end. What fills the space? The practical question once the words have stopped is what to do with the capacity, because the capacity is enormous and unallocated capacity does not stay unallocated. The thing to know is that your attention will find work whether or not you assign it. Left to itself, it will return to the only job it has held for years, which is monitoring an absent person. So the assignment has to be deliberate, and it has to be something that can absorb the same quality of attention you were spending, which means it cannot be distraction. Distraction does not work here, and it is worth understanding why. Distraction occupies the surface of your attention while leaving the deep process running underneath. You can watch 6 hours of something and find that the monitoring never stopped for a second. What absorbs the deep process is anything that requires you to hold a complex thing in mind over time and track its state, which is precisely the skill you have been using. That description covers a lot: learning something difficult, building something. A demanding physical practice that requires ongoing bodily attention, work that has real problems in it, caring for something living. What these have in common is not that they are wholesome. It is that they require sustained tracking, which is the specific function that is currently unemployed. There is also a category worth naming separately, which is other people. Not romantically, at least not immediately. But your attunement is a genuine gift, and it has been pointed at one person who could not use it, and there are friendships in your life that have been operating at a fraction of their possible depth because you did not have the bandwidth. Turning that capacity toward people who reciprocate produces a very fast and very surprising result, which is that the thing you thought was exhausting turns out not to be exhausting at all when it comes back. That discovery does more for your recovery than any amount of insight about avoidant psychology. It corrects the belief, formed under duress, that closeness costs you. Closeness does not cost you. One-directional closeness costs you. You will not believe that until you feel the difference, and you can only feel it by being close to someone who is also paying attention. The physical experience of not explaining. Something happens in the body during this period that people rarely mention, and it is worth naming so it does not alarm you. There is a release, and it is not pleasant at first. Years of held explanation live somewhere physical, in the jaw commonly, in the shoulders and the upper chest, in the specific tightness of a person who is always about to say something difficult and always waiting for the right moment. When the explanations stop, that holding pattern begins to unwind, and the unwinding can produce strange effects. Unexpected tiredness that seems disproportionate to your activity, emotion arriving without a triggering thought, often in the car or the shower, which are the places where the guard drops, a sense of being physically off in a way you cannot locate. This is not a setback. This is stored material being released, and it releases on its own schedule rather than yours, and it does not come out in narrative order. You may find yourself crying about something from year one while feeling nothing about the ending. That is normal. The body does not file things chronologically. The most common form it takes is exhaustion. People are frequently shocked by how tired they are once they stop. They expected to feel free, and instead they feel like they need to sleep for a month. That is because the maintenance work was consuming a real and substantial amount of energy, and the system had been operating on a stress response to cover the deficit, and when the demand stops, the stress response stands down and the accumulated debt becomes noticeable all at once. Let it be tiring. Do not push through it heroically. The tiredness is the bill arriving for work already done, and the only way to pay it is rest. Why this is not about being cold. There is a fear that runs underneath all of this for empaths specifically, and it should be addressed directly because it stops many people from ever going quiet. The fear is that the silence will change you. That in learning not to explain, you will become someone who does not care. That the thing that made you good, the openness, the willingness to go first, the readiness to name what is real, will be sanded off by the experience of having it wasted, and that you will emerge as a guarded person you would not have liked. That fear is reasonable because it does happen to some people. But it happens for a specific reason, and the reason is avoidable. It happens when the silence is adopted as a philosophy rather than a response. When someone concludes from one relationship that openness is dangerous in general and begins applying the withdrawal everywhere as a permanent policy. That produces a genuinely diminished person, and it is the outcome to avoid. What prevents it is precision. The silence is not a general principle about human relationships. It is a specific response to a specific configuration, which is a person who does not answer. That configuration is not universal. It is not even common. It felt universal because you were inside it for years, and prolonged exposure to one environment makes that environment feel like the world. You are not learning that words do not work. You are learning that words do not work on people who do not answer, and that the correct response to a person who does not answer is not more words, it is departure. That is a much narrower lesson, and it does not require you to close. Keep the openness, just add a time limit. The change is not that you stop saying the real thing. The change is that you say it once clearly early, and then you watch what happens, and if nothing happens, you do not say it 40 more times. The generosity remains. The endurance is what goes. The conversation you are still having in your head. You have stopped talking to them out loud. You have almost certainly not stopped talking to them internally, and the internal version deserves as much attention as the external one, because it is doing more damage now. The internal conversation has a recognizable structure. You present something. They respond in your imagination with a deflection you know they would use because you know them extremely well. You counter the deflection. They shift to a different one. You counter that. And the sequence continues, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes across days, and it never reaches a conclusion because you are running both sides, and the side you are running for them is programmed with their actual defenses, which are undefeatable, because that is what defenses are. You cannot win this argument in your head for the same reason you could not win it in the room. You have simulated them accurately, and an accurate simulation of an avoidant person does not concede. Notice what the internal conversation is actually seeking. It is not looking for a winning argument. It is looking for a specific sentence from them, which is some version of "you were right and I understand what I did to you." That sentence is what the entire loop is fishing for, and the loop will keep running as long as you believe that sentence is required. It is not required. That is the release, and it is not an easy one. Nothing in your recovery depends on receiving that sentence. Not one step of it. You can be entirely healed, fully reestablished, deeply loved by someone else, and living well, having never received it. The belief that it is a prerequisite is a leftover from the years when their agreement was the only mechanism by which anything could be resolved, and in that context the belief was accurate. Outside that context, it is simply obsolete. The way to stop the internal conversation is not to suppress it, which does not work. It is to notice, each time it starts, what it is looking for and to answer that directly. When you catch yourself 6 sentences into an imaginary rebuttal, the intervention is not to argue better. It is to name the request. I want them to say I was right. And then to supply the only true response, which is that they will not, and that it is not necessary, and that you already know you were right and have known for a long time. That does not stop it immediately. It stops it eventually, through repetition, in the same way anything is unlearned. What their friends and family will say. You may encounter second-hand or directly an account of the situation from their side, and it will be disorienting, and it is worth being prepared. The version circulating on their end is very unlikely to include the details you would consider essential. It will not include the 4-year pattern. It will not include the pressure valve you were operating. It will likely characterize the ending as sudden, because from their vantage point it was, because they were not reading the accumulation. Frequently, the account will position you as having gone cold, that word or one like it. And you will want to correct it, and you will feel the injustice of it acutely, because the coldness was preceded by an enormous and prolonged period of heat that nobody else observed. You cannot correct it. The record is not going to be set straight in their social circle, and attempting it converts you into a person litigating a breakup, which will make the account they are giving seem more credible rather than less. What helps is understanding why the account has that shape. It is not necessarily a lie. It is what the relationship actually looked like from inside their perceptual system. They genuinely did not register the accumulation because registering accumulation requires exactly the emotional tracking that avoidance shuts off. They are reporting their experience honestly, and their experience was incomplete, and the incompleteness is the whole diagnosis. There will also be people in their circle who know. There always are. People who watched and drew their own conclusions and are not saying so out loud. You will not necessarily hear from them, and their silence is not indifference. It is the ordinary human reluctance to insert oneself into someone else's ending. The thing to do with all of this is nothing. It is genuinely nothing, not as a discipline, but because the alternative costs something and buys nothing. Your reputation among people who are not in the relationship is not a resource you need. The question of whether they loved you. This one arrives at 3 in the morning, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a comforting one. They probably did, in the way available to them, which is real and is also structurally constrained in a way that makes it very difficult to use. Avoidant people love. Often intensely, What is disrupted is not the capacity for the feeling, but the capacity to remain in contact with the feeling while the person is present and available and asking for something. The feeling tends to become most accessible to them at a distance, which is why so many of them experience their strongest emotions about a relationship after it has ended, and why the intensity of their retrospective longing can be so much greater than anything they displayed during. That is not a trick, it is not a strategy. It is what happens when a system pairs love with threat, so that proximity to the loved object triggers the alarm, and the alarm has to be resolved by withdrawal, and only in the withdrawal is there enough distance for the love to become bearable and therefore felt. So the answer to the question is yes, probably, and it does not help. That is the hard part. Because a certain kind of hope survives on the yes. If they loved me, then something was real, then something might still be possible, then the whole thing was not a waste. But love that cannot be delivered is not a lesser version of love that can. It is a different thing entirely from the point of view of the person on the receiving end, because the receiving end does not receive anything. You cannot live inside someone's unexpressed feeling. You can only live inside what is done, and what was done was inconsistent, and inconsistency is what you experienced, and your experience is the accurate measure of what the relationship was regardless of what was happening inside them. That is why the silence is not cruel even if they loved you. It is not a judgment on their interior. It is a response to their exterior, which is the only part that ever touched your life. What changes when you meet someone new? At some point, the silence stops being about them and starts being a property of you, and that is when the next thing becomes possible, and it will not go the way you expect. The first surprise is that you will not know how to be with someone who answers. This sounds absurd, and it is extremely common. You will say a real thing, prepared for the deflection, braced for the subject change, and instead they will respond to it, directly, and you will find yourself with nowhere to put the preparation, holding a defense against something that did not come. Some people find this unpleasant. It produces a kind of exposure. In the old configuration, saying something real was safe precisely because it did not land. You could be as honest as you liked because honesty went into a void. Now it lands, and the landing means the other person actually has it, and having it means they can respond to it, and their response might not be what you want. That is real intimacy, and it is more frightening than what you had. This is the thing that nobody says. The avoidant relationship, for all its pain, contained a kind of safety, which was that you were never at risk of being fully received. You could not be rejected on the basis of your true self because your true self never got delivered. The second surprise is the boredom. The absence of the alarm, the flatness of a person who is simply consistently there, will register initially as an absence of chemistry. That is a calibration problem and not a compatibility signal. You have been reading activation as significance for years, and activation is generated by uncertainty, and consistent people do not generate it. Give that a year before drawing conclusions. It changes. What changes is not that the person becomes more exciting. It is that your baseline resets, and once the alarm-based reading of significance fades, a different signal becomes detectable underneath it, and that one is quieter and considerably more durable. The third surprise is the most useful. You will find that you use fewer words with a person who answers than you did with a person who did not. Substantially fewer, because the volume of speech in the old relationship was not a measure of how much you had to say, it was a measure of how little was getting through. When things get through the first time, you stop repeating them, and the silence you were forced into becomes the silence you choose, and it feels completely different. That is the actual destination. Not the silence of withholding, not the silence of exhaustion, the ordinary uneventful quiet of two people who have already said what needed saying and were heard, where the talking habit actually came from. If you look back honestly, this relationship is not where you learn to over-explain. It is where you applied a skill you already had, and knowing where it came from is what determines whether you are finished with this or between installments. Somewhere early, there was an environment in which being understood was conditional on your effort, where an adult's mood determined the temperature of a room, and you developed the ability to forecast it. Where your feelings were not automatically valid but had to be argued for, justified, made reasonable before they could be acknowledged. Where saying "I'm upset" produced the question why, and the why had to be answered persuasively, and an unpersuasive answer meant the upset did not count. A child in that environment becomes a person who explains. Not because they are verbose, but because explanation is the toll they learn to pay for being allowed to have an internal state. They learn that feelings do not stand on their own. They require documentation. That skill becomes highly refined. By adulthood, you can construct an argument for your own emotions that is so well supported it would hold up in court. And you deploy it constantly in every relationship, often before anyone has asked, because you have never operated under conditions where a feeling was simply accepted as a fact about you. Then you meet someone who does not answer, and the explaining machinery has infinite work, and it runs at capacity for years. The thing to understand is that the machinery is not required in a functional relationship. This is genuinely news to many people. In a functional relationship, you say "I did not like that," and the other person says "okay," and there is no cross-examination and no burden of proof. The feeling is treated as information rather than as a claim requiring evidence. The first time you experience that, it is disorienting. You will have your argument prepared and it will not be needed, and you will feel almost cheated because you built a case and there is no trial. That is what you are moving toward, a life in which your internal states do not have to be litigated. And the silence is the first step, not because silence is the goal, but because you cannot discover that the explaining was unnecessary while you are still doing it. The signals that someone can actually receive you. Because you will need to distinguish at some point between a person who is worth speaking to and a person who is not. Here are the markers, and they show up early if you are watching. They ask a follow-up question. This is the single most reliable indicator, and it is astonishing how well it discriminates. When you say something with any weight to it, do they want more or do they respond and move on? A follow-up question means they are building a model of you. The absence of follow-up questions across many exchanges means they are not. They bring something back. They reference a thing you told them weeks ago, unprompted, in a context where it was relevant. That means the information went in and was stored and is being used. The avoidant configuration frequently does not do this, not out of disrespect, but because the tracking that would store it is the same tracking they have shut down. They tolerate your dissatisfaction without collapsing or attacking. Say a small negative thing early, deliberately, something low stakes. Watch what happens in their face. A person who can receive it will simply receive it. A person who cannot will either go flat, become defensive, or immediately apologize with an intensity out of proportion to the offense, which is its own kind of exit. They initiate. Not always, not equally, but sometimes without prompting, in a pattern that does not correlate with your having recently pulled back. This is the diagnostic that catches the intermittent configuration, because in that configuration initiation is reliably inverse to your availability, and once you see that inversion you can never unsee it, and they are the same person across contexts. The version of them with you resembles the version with their friends, their family, at work. Avoidant configurations frequently produce dramatic context dependence because the self that appears is a function of how much intimacy is being demanded, and different contexts demand different amounts. None of these require a conversation about the relationship. All of them are observable within weeks. That is the point. You spent 4 years trying to establish through discussion what could have been determined through observation in a month, and the reason you did not observe is that observing would have produced an answer you did not want. The thing silence cannot do. For honesty, there is a limit to all of this, and it should be stated plainly, because there is a version of this material that promises too much. Silence will not bring them back as a different person. It will not produce transformation. It is not a technique for generating the relationship you wanted through strategic absence. Any framework that suggests otherwise is selling the same waiting you have been doing in a package that feels more active. What silence does is stop a specific ongoing harm and return a specific quantity of energy. That is a great deal. It is not everything, and it is emphatically not a route back. If they return, and some do, they will return as the same person with the same regulatory system and the same threshold. The return will feel different for a while because the loss will have temporarily raised their tolerance. An elevated tolerance following loss is a real and temporary phenomenon that resolves in a matter of months as the fear of losing you recedes. Then the threshold returns to baseline. Then the pattern resumes. Then you are 2 years older. This is not universal. Some people do change. But the change requires sustained, deliberate work over years, usually with professional support, undertaken in the absence of the person it would benefit, and it does not correlate with the intensity of their post-breakup distress. Distress is not work. Distress is what happens when a regulatory system loses its regulator, and it produces enormous feeling and very little structural change. So hold the silence for what it actually is, not a strategy with an outcome attached, a cessation. And judge it by what it does for you, which is measurable, rather than by what it does to them, which is unverifiable and not yours. The slow return of your own voice. Here is something that will happen, and it is the best part, and it arrives without announcement. Your voice comes back, not the explaining voice, the other one, the one that says things because they are true rather than because they need to be established. It will show up first in low-stakes places. You will be with a friend and a direct observation will simply exit you, unqualified, without the preamble you would normally attach. You will notice afterward, where did that come from? It came from the part of you that was doing all the observing during those years. It never stopped working. It was just disconnected from your mouth by a long habit of pre-screening, and the pre-screening is fed by the expectation that direct speech produces withdrawal, and once that expectation stops being confirmed daily, the screening loses its power source. The reconnection is uneven. There will be days when it flows and days when the old machinery reboots for no reason and you catch yourself softening something for a person who never asked you to. Do not treat that as failure. The system took years to build and was, for a long time, genuinely protective. It disassembles through repeated demonstration that it is not needed, and demonstration requires many instances, and instances take time. What accelerates it is noticing. When you catch yourself qualifying, just note it. Do not force the unqualified version. That pressure creates its own problems. Simply observe that the machinery ran. Observation alone does most of the work because the machinery depends on being invisible and loses efficiency once it has been seen. And when the direct thing does come out and someone receives it without flinching, register the moment consciously. That is a data point contradicting a model you built over years. You need many of them and they accumulate one at a time, and each one counts even though none of them is dramatic. What you learn about your own strength. There is an identity revision happening in you right now, and it deserves to be named because most people go through it without noticing and therefore do not get the benefit. You have believed probably for a long time that your defining feature is your softness, that what you bring is warmth, patience, the willingness to keep trying, the capacity to love someone difficult. And there is a shadow version of that belief, which is that you are not tough, that you are the kind of person things happen to, that your strength, such as it is entirely the endurance kind. The silence disproves that, and it disproves it with evidence you generated yourself, because what you are doing right now is extremely difficult. It is difficult in a way that people who have not done it consistently underestimate. Every day of it involves overriding a powerful and persistent impulse in service of a decision you made with your judgment rather than your feeling. That is precisely the definition of the kind of strength you have believed you lack. You have been strong the whole time. You were simply spending the strength on endurance rather than on direction, and endurance is invisible to everyone including the person performing it, which is why you never got credit from yourself. Now the same strength is pointed at something else and the results are visible, and you can see them in your own behavior daily. That revision matters beyond this relationship, because the belief that you are soft but not strong is what makes you tolerate things. It is the mechanism. If you are only capable of enduring, then endurance is your only option, and every difficult situation becomes something to be outlasted rather than exited. Discovering that you can exit changes the entire menu. You will find over the next year that you leave things faster, jobs that are wrong, friendships that only run one way, conversations that have become extractive, not dramatically. Just earlier with less agonizing, because you have proof now that you are capable of the harder thing, and having done it once you stop treating it as impossible. Why they will remember this longer than the relationship. There is a specific reason that avoidant people carry this particular ending for years, and it is not because it was more painful than other endings. It is because it is unprocessable through their usual methods. Consider how they normally resolve a loss. They locate a reason external to themselves, usually a quality of the other person. The last one was too demanding. The one before that was unstable. The one before that wanted more than they were ready for. Each ending gets a filed explanation and the file closes and the pattern continues undisturbed. Your ending does not offer the materials for that file. You did not become demanding at the end. You became quiet. You did not escalate, accuse, threaten, or create a scene that could be characterized afterward. You simply stopped. And stopping does not provide the raw material for a story in which the other person was the problem. Worse, from their perspective, is that stopping is a behavior they recognize. It is their own primary move. You did the thing they do, and you did it cleanly, without the ambivalence that characterizes their version, and the recognition is uncomfortable in a way that nothing else in the relationship was. So they are left with an ending that has no assignable external cause, and no available narrative, and no closure conversation from which to extract material. And a mind that cannot resolve something does not put it down. It keeps it in circulation, returning to it, examining it, looking for the missing piece that would allow the file to close. That is why it lasts, not because your silence was devastating, because it was uncategorizable. You should know this and then stop thinking about it, because it belongs to the same category as everything else on their side, which is to say it is real, it is happening, and it is not yours. The days you will almost break. There will be specific days, not a general period, specific ones, and they are predictable enough to prepare for. The first is an anniversary of something. Not necessarily a relationship milestone. Sometimes it is something incidental, a date that had significance for a reason nobody else would understand. The pull on those days is sharp and it feels meaningful in a way that ordinary days do not, and the meaningfulness is a trick of the calendar rather than a signal about anything real. The second is a day when something good happens to you. This surprises people. You would expect the pull to come during difficulty, and it does sometimes, but the stronger version comes with good news because you have a reflex to tell them, and the reflex outlives the relationship by a long margin. Something happens, and before you have finished registering it, some part of you has already composed the message. The third is a day when you see evidence of them living, a photograph, a mutual friend mentioning something in passing, evidence that life is continuing over there without any apparent damage. That one produces a very specific pain, which is not jealousy exactly, but something closer to erasure, the sense that the whole thing meant so little that it left no visible mark, it left marks. You are not seeing them because the marks are internal and because people manage their exteriors carefully, particularly avoidant people, for whom the appearance of being unaffected is a lifelong project. The fourth is a day when you are simply tired. No trigger, no anniversary, no news, just depleted, and the depletion lowers the barrier, and the old habit walks in through the gap. This one is the most dangerous precisely because it has no story attached, so there is no obvious thing to counter. The preparation for all of them is the same, and it is mechanical rather than emotional. Decide now while you are clear what you will do, not what you will feel. You do not control that, what you will do, where the phone goes, who you call instead. What the specific replacement action is. Decisions made in advance by a clear version of you are the only thing that reliably survives contact with a depleted version of you at 11 at night. What your silence says that words never could. There is one thing communicated by the silence that no sentence could have delivered, and it is worth stating explicitly because it is the actual content of the message. Every word you ever said in that relationship contained an implicit premise, which was that the relationship should continue. That is what explaining is. You do not explain to someone you have finished with. The act of explaining says, I am still here, I still want this to work, I am still investing in the outcome. Which means that no matter how severe the content of what you said, the form of it always undercut the severity. You could say this is unbearable, and the fact that you were saying it at all said, and I am staying. They heard the form, not the content, every time. The silence has the opposite structure. Its content is nothing and its form says everything. It says the investment has ended. It says the outcome is no longer being worked toward. It says, without any of the ambiguity that words carry, that the thing is over. That is why it lands when 4 years of explanation did not because it is louder. Because for the first time, the form and the content of your communication agree. You spent years saying, I cannot keep doing this, while continuing to do it. The contradiction meant the sentence was not information, it was noise. And the moment the doing stopped, the sentence became true, and true things register in a way that noise does not. This is also why you cannot say it. The moment you announce the silence, you have converted it back into a communication, and a communication implies a recipient, and a recipient implies a relationship, and the relationship is the thing that ended. An announced departure is a negotiation, an actual departure is a fact. Coming back to yourself. Underneath all of this, there is a simpler thing happening, and it is worth putting plainly because the analysis can obscure it. You are returning to your own life, that is all this is. Not a strategy, not a lesson, not a victory over another person, just the ordinary and difficult process of an attention that has been pointed outward for years turning back around. Most of what you will experience over the next months is that turning. The strangeness, the tiredness, the odd flashes of grief, the surprising clarity, the boredom, the moments of unexpected joy that arrive from nowhere and seem disproportionate. All of it is the same process, a large amount of you coming home, and when it is finished or finished enough, the thing you will notice is not triumph. It is not a moment where you feel you have won. It is something quieter and much better, which is that you will be doing something ordinary, and you will realize that you have not thought about them in some length of time, and that the not thinking was not an achievement. It was just what happened. That is the end of it, not a message, not an apology. Not a realization delivered to your door in the form you spent years hoping for, just a Tuesday in which they are simply not present. You do not have to say anything to get there. That is the entire point. Everything that needed to be said was said repeatedly at length by you to someone who could not receive it. There is nothing left to add. The saying is finished. What remains is the living, which you have been postponing and which has been available the whole time. what you are actually taking with you. Before this closes, it is worth taking inventory, because you will be tempted to characterize these years as lost, and they were not lost. You have a calibrated instrument now. You can identify the pattern in weeks rather than years. That is not a small thing. Most people carry it for decades and repeat it 3 or 4 times before they see it. You have seen it from the inside in full detail, and the seeing is permanent. You have a demonstrated capacity for the hard exit. You did the thing you believed you could not do. Whatever happens in the rest of your life, when you are in a situation that requires leaving, you will have evidence that you are a person who leaves. You have your perception back, and it has been proven accurate. Everything you thought was happening was happening. You were not paranoid, not too sensitive, not making things up. The verification is complete, and it came from reality rather than from anyone's admission. You have the skill itself, uncontaminated. The attunement, the patience, the enormous tolerance for complexity, the ability to hold 2 things at once. All of that is real ability, and it was developed under difficult conditions, and it belongs to you regardless of where you learned it. Pointed at someone who reciprocates, it becomes the thing that makes you an extraordinary partner rather than an exhausted one. And you have the years back, not the ones that passed. Those are gone, and it is allowed to grieve them without the grief meaning you wasted your life. The ones ahead. The ones you would have spent continuing, which is the actual quantity at stake, and which is much larger than the amount already spent. That is what the silence bought, not their suffering, not their realization. The remaining time returned to you uncommitted. The 5 things your words were actually doing. To fully release the talking, it helps to see the specific jobs it was performing, because each one has to be reassigned somewhere else or it will simply resume. The first job was regulation of your own anxiety. When something happened that produced fear in you, saying it out loud reduced the fear temporarily. Not because it got resolved, it rarely did, but because articulation itself lowers arousal. You were self-soothing through speech, and the person you were speaking to was largely incidental to the mechanism. That job now needs a different home. Writing does it. Talking to someone who actually listens does it. The point is that the need is real, and it will find an outlet, and if you do not give it one, it will find the old one. The second job was reality testing. You said things partly to check whether your perception was accurate, and their response, however inadequate, functioned as feedback. This is why the conversations were so destabilizing when they went badly, because the destabilization was not only emotional, it was epistemic. You lost your grip on what had happened. That job needs to be reassigned to someone reliable, and it should be someone reliable, because reality testing with an unreliable partner is worse than not doing it at all. The third job was maintenance of hope. As long as you were still explaining, the relationship was still in progress. Speech was the proof of ongoing possibility. This is the job that is hardest to reassign because its function was to keep something alive that has now ended, and the honest answer is that this one does not get reassigned. It gets grieved. The fourth job was documentation. Some part of you was building a record so that if the whole thing collapsed, you would be able to demonstrate that you tried, that the collapse was not your fault, that you had done everything. This job can be closed permanently, right now, because the record is complete and the verdict is already in, and you do not owe an accounting to anyone, including yourself. The fifth job was connection. This is the one that hurts. Talking to them was, whatever else it was, contact. Even a bad conversation was a conversation. Even a deflection was a response. The silence removes not only the frustration but also the last remaining form of touch, and that loss is real and should not be minimized by the fact that the touch was inadequate. Inadequate contact is still contact, and losing it is still loss. Naming these 5 is useful because when you feel the pull to break the silence, you can ask which job is asking for work. Usually it is the third or the fifth, and knowing which one changes the response, because the third one needs grief and the fifth one needs other people, and neither of them needs a message. The difference between being quiet and being unavailable. There's a nuance here that matters practically, particularly if you're still in the same city, the same workplace, the same family, or otherwise cannot fully disappear. Silence in the sense meant here does not require rudeness or theatrical avoidance. If you must interact, you can interact. What has ended is not politeness. What has ended is the labor. The distinction is this: you can answer a practical question. You cannot supply the emotional interpretation that used to accompany it. You can be present in a room. You cannot monitor the room's temperature and adjust yourself to manage it. You can say hello. You cannot conduct the follow-up that turns hello into an opening. This will feel unnatural for a while because you have spent years unable to be near this person without working. The practice is to be physically present and internally uncommitted, and it is harder than it sounds, and it gets easier faster than you would expect. There is a specific thing to watch for in these situations. They will, at some point, offer you an opening, a comment with a hook in it. Something slightly personal, delivered in a way that invites elaboration. This is the reach in a live format, and it has the same function as the message version, which is to test whether the field is still there. You can respond to the surface and not the hook. That is the entire skill. They say something that could be an opening, and you answer only what was literally asked, and you do not extend it, and you do not close it rudely either. You simply do not take the hook. What you will notice doing this is how much energy the hook-taking used to require and how strange it feels not to. There is a small physical sensation of an unused impulse. That sensation is the whole change happening in real time. What other empaths get wrong about this? Because you may encounter a great deal of material on this subject and much of it will point you in a direction that costs you, it is worth naming the common errors. The first error is treating silence as a phase with a duration. 30 days, 60 days, a set period after which contact resumes. This converts the silence into a waiting room and reintroduces the exact posture it was supposed to end. A period with a scheduled ending is not a departure. It is a pause, and both parties can feel that it is a pause, which is why it produces nothing. The second error is announcing it, telling them that you need space, that you are taking time, that you will reach out when you are ready. This feels honest and mature, and it functions as a communication, which means it does the opposite of what is intended. It tells them the connection persists and provides a timeline. It converts your absence into a scheduled event that they can simply wait out. The third error is silence with monitoring, not contacting them while consuming everything available about their life. This is the most common version, and it is the least effective because the energy expenditure is identical to the relationship and only the direction of the visible traffic has changed. You are still working, they just cannot see it. The fourth error is confusing silence with the absence of feeling. Some people, in the effort to be genuinely detached, suppress the grief, and the suppressed grief then sits in the body and prolongs everything. You are allowed to be devastated and quiet at the same time. Those are not in conflict. The silence is about what you do, not about what you feel, and requiring yourself to feel nothing sets a standard that will make you fail at both. The fifth error is expecting the silence to produce something. This has been said, and it bears saying again because it is the error that reasserts itself most persistently. The silence is not a mechanism for generating an outcome in another person. It is a cessation of expenditure. If you can hold that framing, the whole thing becomes sustainable, because a cessation does not require results to justify itself. The version of you that existed before this. There is someone worth remembering, and finding them again is a substantial part of what comes next. Before this relationship, there was a version of you who said things without calculating, who had opinions that arrived at full strength rather than pre-hedged, who did not scan a room on entry. That person existed and is not gone, though they may feel unreachable at the moment. Try to remember something specific about them. Not a general sense, but an actual instance. A time you said something blunt and did not think about it afterward. A conversation you left without reviewing. An occasion when you wanted something and simply said so. That memory is useful because it functions as evidence. The habit you have now is a habit rather than a personality, and the proof is that there was a period before it, and things that have a before are things that can have an after. The recovery is not an invention of a new person. It is the removal of an overlay. Everything under it has been maintained the whole time, running quietly, doing the observing, keeping the accurate record. That is why the clarity comes back so fast once the fogging stops. It was never actually destroyed. It was covered. What will surprise you is how quickly some of it returns. Within a few months, people frequently report that their sense of humor comes back, which is a strange and specific marker, but a consistent one. Humor requires a kind of relaxed attention that is impossible when a large percentage of your processing is committed to threat management. When the commitment ends, the humor returns, often before anything else, and often before you feel meaningfully better. Watch for that. It arrives early, and it means the underlying system is intact. Why this will not happen to you again the same way. The reason to go through all of this in detail rather than simply moving on is that detail is what makes a pattern non-repeatable, and a vague sense that something went wrong does not protect you. What you have now is a specific model. You know what the early signals look like. You know that inconsistency in the first 2 months is not a phase. You know that a person who does not ask follow-up questions is not going to develop the habit later. You know that warmth which increases when you pull back and decreases when you approach is a signature rather than a coincidence. You know that explaining more clearly does not help, and that the impulse to explain more clearly is itself the warning sign. More importantly, you know what it feels like from the inside. That is the part that is not available from books. You know the specific quality of the anxiety. You know what it is like to be composing a message for 40 minutes. You know the feeling of a conversation that produced agreement and changed nothing. Those are somatic memories now, and they will fire early next time, well before your conscious analysis catches up. That firing is your protection. It is not paranoia and it is not damage. It is a trained detection system that cost you a great deal to install, and it will save you years, and it will do so quietly, by making you leave situations early that you would previously have stayed in. There is one caution: the system can overfire in the first stretch, flagging ordinary human inconsistency as the pattern. Everyone is occasionally distracted, occasionally slow to respond, occasionally not at their best. The pattern is not any single instance. It is the shape across time, and specifically it is the inverse relationship between your investment and their availability. Give people the 2 weeks, watch the shape rather than the instance, and trust that you can tell the difference because you can. You have more data on this than almost anyone: the silence and the body. There is a physical education happening in this period that runs parallel to the emotional one, and paying attention to it accelerates everything. Your body has been in a low-grade activation state for a long time. Not dramatic, not constant panic, but a persistent readiness. The shoulders slightly up, the breath slightly shallow, a jaw that is doing something even when you are alone. That is what it looks like to live with a person whose state you have to monitor. When the monitoring ends, the body does not immediately relax. Bodies are slower than minds and considerably more stubborn. What happens instead is that the activation remains for a while with nothing to justify it, and this produces a strange sensation of anxiety without an object. You will feel keyed up and be unable to identify a reason. There is no reason. That is the point. The reason ended and the physiology has not caught up. What helps is not thinking about it. Thinking is the wrong tool for a physical state. What helps is anything that gives the body a different job. Long walks work better than most things because the rhythm and the duration together produce a downshift that nothing cognitive can achieve. Heavy physical effort works. Cold water works for some people. So does the boring, unglamorous discipline of a regular sleep schedule, which is the single highest return intervention available and which almost nobody does. The reason to attend to this is not general wellness advice. It is that a dysregulated body makes bad decisions at 11 at night. The impulse to break the silence is not primarily an intellectual failure. It is a physiological state producing an urge, and the urge then recruits reasoning to justify itself. Handle the state and the urge diminishes and the reasoning never gets deployed. You will also notice at some point a specific physical release. It arrives without warning, often during something ordinary, and it feels like a section of your torso letting go of something it had been holding. People describe it as a sigh that goes further down than usual. That is stored tension leaving, and it means the system has registered that the threat is actually over, and it is one of the more reliable signs that the recovery is real rather than performed. What happens if they come back? It is worth walking through this scenario in advance calmly while you are clear, because if it happens you will not be clear. They will not return with a proposal. That is the first thing to know. The return, if it comes, will be exploratory. It will contain warmth and it will contain no plan. It will reference what you had. It may include an acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement may be genuine and may be moving, and it will be general rather than specific. I did not appreciate what I had. I was not in a good place. I have been thinking about you. Notice what is absent from all of those: any description of what you experienced, any specific account of a specific thing they did, any statement of what would be different and how. That absence is diagnostic and it is not accidental. Specificity requires having done the work of reconstructing your experience, which requires the sustained empathic contact that the avoidance pattern shuts down. A general acknowledgement is what remorse looks like when it has been felt rather than examined. The second thing to know is that your body will respond before you do. If you had a strong bond and you did, the response to their return is not something you decide. It is a flood, and it arrives fast, and it will feel like proof of something. It is not proof of anything except that attachment systems are powerful and do not update on the timeline of insight. The third thing is the one that actually matters. The question to hold is not, do I still love them, because you probably do, and the answer does not tell you anything actionable. The question is what has changed, not in their feelings, which have changed temporarily under the pressure of loss, in their capacity. Have they done anything over months in your absence without expectation of your knowing that would alter the underlying regulatory pattern? Is there evidence of sustained work, not statements about intention, evidence? Almost always there is not, because the loss produces motivation and motivation produces contact rather than work. and by the time actual work would have shown results, the motivation has faded. If there is evidence, and occasionally there is, then the conversation is a different one, and it is not covered here, and it should be had slowly, over a long period, with very low stakes at each step, and with your own perception given full authority rather than being negotiated. If there is not, then the return is not an offer. It is a request that you resume the job. And you already know what the job cost because you have spent all this time recovering from it. The grief nobody warns you about. There is a specific loss embedded in all of this that arrives late and takes people by surprise because it does not look like grief for a person. It is grief for the version of yourself who tried. That person was extraordinary. They were patient beyond reason. They kept finding new ways to say the same thing, not out of stupidity, but out of an almost unreasonable faith that the right key existed. They absorbed disappointment after disappointment and kept showing up warm. They were, in a very real sense, magnificent, and they were also being consumed, and part of what has happened is that you had to end them in order to survive. You will miss that person, not the suffering, but the quality of hope they carried. There was something bright in it, a belief that love was strong enough, that persistence mattered, that no one is unreachable. That belief was beautiful, and it was also, in this specific case, wrong, and losing it feels like losing an innocence. This is the deepest loss in the whole thing, and it is rarely named because it does not have an obvious object. You are not grieving a person or a future. You are grieving a way of being in the world that you cannot go back to now that you know what you know. It is worth grieving properly. Do not rush past it into a hardened version of yourself, because the hardened version is not the only alternative to the consumed one. What you're moving toward is a third thing. Someone who still has the warmth and the willingness but has attached a limit to it. Who still goes first, still says the real thing, still assumes good faith, and who also leaves when the evidence says to leave. That person is not less generous than the one you were. They are generous with a functioning immune system. The transition between those two people is what you are in right now, and it is uncomfortable, and it does not have a clear midpoint, and the discomfort is not a sign that you have lost something permanent. The long view. Zoom out for a moment, because the time scale you are living in right now is distorting everything. You are measuring this in days. That is what acute periods do. The unit of time shrinks, and each day feels like a substantial fraction of the total, and progress that is real becomes invisible because it happens too slowly to register at that resolution. At the timescale of years, this is a bounded episode, difficult, formative, expensive, and bounded. People who are 10 years past this describe it consistently as a hinge point rather than as a wound, and they describe it without much heat, and the descriptions are usually shorter than you would expect. The thing that occupies your entire field of vision right now becomes, eventually, a chapter with a beginning and an end. That is not a dismissal of what you are feeling. The feeling is proportionate to the current view. It is just information about the view, and there is something specific that happens at that longer distance. What people report almost universally is that they became more themselves through it, not despite it, and not because suffering is ennobling, which it usually is not, but because the experience forced a choice that most people never have to make explicitly, which is whether to keep spending yourself on something that will not return anything. Almost everyone faces some version of that choice. Most people never make it consciously. You have made it in full awareness at cost, and the making of it establishes something about how you will handle every similar situation for the rest of your life. That is the actual return on this, not the wisdom about attachment styles, which is useful but secondary, the demonstrated capacity to stop. The questions that will not leave you alone. Some questions keep returning regardless of how many times they are answered, and they deserve direct treatment rather than reassurance. Was I too much? No, and the evidence is in the shape of what you asked for. Go back and look at the actual content of the requests, consistency, clarity about where things stood, being told when plans changed. Some indication that you were being thought about. These are not extravagant. They are the ordinary infrastructure of an adult relationship, and the fact that they registered as excessive is information about the environment, not about the size of the request. Would they have done this to anyone? Largely yes, though the intensity varies with how much the other person requires. A partner who requires very little may experience a much milder version, and from outside it may look as though they were capable of more with someone else. What actually happened is that a lower demand produced a lower defense. That is not growth, and it is not evidence that you were the problem. Why did it take me so long? Because the reinforcement schedule you were on is the most powerful behavioral conditioning pattern that exists, and it was not designed by them. It emerged from the structure of the situation. Unpredictable intermittent reward produces the most persistent behavior of any schedule known in every species tested. Your persistence was not a character flaw. It was a species-level response to a specific input pattern. Am I going to be alone now? This is the fear underneath most of the others, and it deserves a straight answer. Statistically, no. Practically, the change you are making increases rather than decreases your chances, because the thing that has been costing you relationships is not a shortage of options, it is a filter that was calibrated to accept configurations that could not work. Fixing the filter does not reduce your options. It reduces the fraction of your options that are wrong. Did I waste those years? You spent them. Spent is different from wasted. Something was purchased at a high price, and it is worth being clear about what. A permanent and detailed understanding of a pattern that will now be visible to you within weeks rather than years. A demonstrated capacity to leave. A recalibrated sense of what you will tolerate. Whether that was worth the price is a question with no useful answer, because the transaction is complete and non-reversible, and the only remaining decision is what you do with what you bought. The small practice that changes everything. If everything else in this is too much to hold, there is one practice that contains the whole of it, and it takes about 10 seconds at a time. When you notice you are about to explain something for the second time, stop. That is it, not the first time. The first time is legitimate and necessary, and you should always say the real thing plainly. It is the second time that carries the whole disease, because the second time is where you begin to treat the other person's failure to respond as a problem with your delivery rather than as information about them. Everything you went through is contained in the gap between the first time and the 50th, and the intervention point is not at 50, where it is obviously too late. It is at 2, where it is barely noticeable and where the whole trajectory is still available to be changed. Practice this in small places first, at work when a request is ignored, with a friend who does the same irritating thing, in any low-stakes situation where you notice the impulse to re-explain. Say it once, then wait, then observe what happens rather than trying again with better wording. What you will discover is that in most functional relationships, once is enough. The re-explaining is not necessary and never was, and the situations where once is not enough are the situations that were going to be expensive, and you will now identify them in a week instead of in a decade. This practice also has an internal effect that is worth more than the external one. Every time you say something once and do not repeat it, you demonstrate to yourself that your statement was sufficient, that it stood on its own, that you do not have to build a case for your own experience, and that demonstration, repeated, gradually dismantles the belief installed long ago that your feelings require documentation. Your silence is not a message. One last clarification, because the whole framing of this could easily be misread as a technique, and if you take it as a technique, it will not work and it will cost you. Nothing in this has been advice about how to affect them. Everything described about their experience is a description of what happens, not a set of instructions for producing it. The distinction is not a technicality. It is the difference between recovering and performing recovery. If you go quiet in order to produce a specific reaction, you have not stopped working. You have changed the format of the work. The energy expenditure is identical, the orientation is identical, the monitoring is identical, and the only thing that has changed is that the labor has become invisible, including to you, which makes it harder to notice and therefore harder to stop. The silence works because it is not a message. Its entire power comes from the absence of intention behind it. The moment it acquires an intention, it becomes a communication, and communications can be waited out, and this one would be, and you would be back where you started with additional months spent. So the correct relationship to everything described here is this. Read it, understand it, and then set it down. Do not carry it around as a map of what is happening on their side. Do not check the timeline against it. Do not use it to interpret whatever fragments of information reach you. Use it only for the one thing it is actually good for, which is to reassure you on the difficult nights that the quiet is not a failure of love and not a form of cruelty and not something you should feel guilty about. It is what happens when a person stops doing a job they were never assigned and never paid for and could not sustain. That is all it is, and that is enough, the myth of the final conversation. There is one fantasy left to dismantle, and it is the most persistent one, and it survives long after everything else has been understood. It is the fantasy of the conversation that would work. Not the one you had, the one you could have had under better conditions at the right moment with the right preparation. In this fantasy, you sit down with them at a time when they are calm and receptive, and you say the thing, and it is perfectly constructed, and something in them opens, and they see it, and everything shifts. That conversation has a strange status in your mind. It has never happened, and yet it feels like a real possibility that was somehow missed. Like a door you walked past. There was no door, and here is how you can know. You have had that conversation many times in fragments distributed across years. Every element of the perfect version has already been delivered at some point, under some conditions, in some form. There is no sentence in the ideal version that has not already been said to them in some approximation. The perfect conversation is not a new communication. It is a compilation of communications that have all already occurred and all already produced the same result. What the fantasy actually contains that the real attempts did not is not better words, it is their receptivity. That is the variable being altered. In the fantasy, they are able to hear it, and their ability to hear it is not something your phrasing controls, which means the fantasy is not about a conversation at all. It is about a different person. You are imagining what it would be like to say these things to someone capable of receiving them, and you have located that imagined person inside the body of someone who is not, because that is where you needed them to be. The relief in recognizing this is enormous, and it takes a while to arrive, because what it means is that you did not miss the door. You did not fail to find the right words. There was no configuration of language available to any human being that would have produced the outcome, and the years you have spent auditing your own performance looking for the error were auditing a process that had no error in it. The conversation you are imagining is available. It is just not available with them. It is available with someone else, and it will happen eventually, and it will not require any special preparation because it will not be a rescue attempt. It will just be talking, when the silence becomes ordinary. Something happens at a certain point that is easy to miss, and it is the actual finish line, and it does not look like one. The silence stops being maintained. That is the transition. For a long stretch, it is a policy. It requires attention, it requires decisions, it has a status you check. Are you still not talking to them? Yes, that yes is an active thing, and then at some unmarked point the question stops occurring, not because you have decided harder, because the situation has changed state. There is no longer a silence being kept in the same way that you are not currently maintaining a policy of not calling someone you went to school with 20 years ago. You just do not call them. It is not a decision. It is a fact about your life. Getting to that state is not accomplished by trying. It is accomplished by the accumulation of enough new material that the old material stops being the main content of your existence. Time does some of this on its own. The rest comes from actually filling the time, which is why the practical advice about occupying your capacity is not filler. It is the mechanism. There is a specific marker people report. It is the moment when you hear something about them and feel nothing, not suppressed nothing, actual nothing. Someone mentions their name and your body does not change. That is the state arriving. It arrives later than you want and earlier than you fear, and it arrives without any event marking it, which is why so many people do not notice they have healed until well after the fact. Saying it once and only once. For the future, there is a single practice that contains everything in this, and it is worth stating in a form you can carry. Say the real thing once, clearly, early, without a preamble and without a softening clause and without converting it into a question. Then watch, that is the whole method, everything else follows from it. Because a person who can receive it will respond to it, and the response will be visible within days, and you will not have to wonder. And a person who cannot receive it will do one of the recognizable things: deflect, go flat, become vague, produce warmth without change, and that response is also visible within days, and it is the answer. The pathology was never that you spoke. It was that you kept speaking after receiving the answer. 50 repetitions of a message that was fully understood the first time is not communication. It is hope expressed through a medium that cannot carry it. One time, then observation. Then a decision based on what you observed rather than on what you hoped the next attempt would produce. That single change will save you years. Not because it will make people better at loving you, but because it will tell you very quickly who is capable of it, and the speed of the information is the entire benefit. You are not trying to convert anyone, you are trying to find out, and finding out takes one clear statement and about 2 weeks of paying attention. You already have the paying attention, you have always had it. You have some of the best perception of anyone in your life, and you have been spending it on interpretation instead of on decision. Point it at the decision. That is all that has to change. What the quiet sounds like after a year. There's a version of you about 12 months from wherever you're standing, and it is worth describing, because having a destination makes the middle easier to walk through. That person does not think about this much, not as a discipline, just as a fact. The name comes up occasionally and produces something mild, a small acknowledgement rather than a reaction. The years are still there, fully remembered, and the remembering does not hurt in the way it does now. It has become history rather than an open situation. That person speaks differently, shorter, more direct. They say the thing and then they stop, and the stopping is not effortful, it just happens, because the machinery that used to keep going has nothing to run on. They have discovered that most people respond well to directness, and that the ones who do not are people they no longer spend time with, and the discovery has made them a little more confident in a way that others notice without being able to identify. That person is more available, not less. This is the part that would be hard to believe right now. The prediction feels like it should go the other way, that a person who has been through this becomes guarded. What actually happens when the recovery goes well is that the enormous capacity that was locked up in one relationship gets distributed, and the distribution makes them a better friend, a more present family member, more engaged with work, more interested in things. That person has a limit, and the limit is the main change. They will still go first. They will still assume good faith. They will still be the one who says the true thing in a room where nobody is saying it. And if it is not returned, they will notice within weeks, and they will withdraw the investment without a speech, and they will not agonize about whether they should have tried a different phrasing. That person is not harder than you. They are just finished with a specific experiment, and they know the result, and knowing the result means they do not have to run it again. You will be that person. Not through effort exactly, and not on a schedule you control. Through the accumulation of ordinary days in which the old work does not get done, until the not doing becomes the default and the whole configuration reorganizes around it. That is the whole process. It is much less dramatic than the relationship was. That is how you will know it is working. The word empath and what it actually means here. The title uses the word empath, and it is worth being precise about it, because the word has been stretched into vagueness, and the vague version will not help you. It does not mean someone who is nicer than average. It does not mean someone with special intuition. What it means in the sense that matters for this is a person whose nervous system produces a matching state in response to another person's state, involuntarily, at a higher intensity than most people experience. That is a physiological description, not a compliment, and understanding it as physiology rather than as virtue changes what you do about it. Because if it is a virtue, then the failure to protect yourself is a moral problem and you can be blamed for it. If it is a physiological feature, then the failure to protect yourself is a design consequence, and the solution is structural rather than moral. The structure is this: you cannot turn the response off. It is automatic and preconscious, and no amount of resolve will prevent you from feeling what the person across from you is feeling. What you can do is control your exposure, which means controlling who you spend sustained time with, which means the decision has to be made before the response is triggered rather than after. That is the entire practical implication, and it explains why the silence works and why conversation does not. In conversation, the response is live and it overrides you. In absence, the response has no input and your judgment operates unimpaired. So the strategy for a person built like you is not to become tougher in the room. That is not available. It is to be more selective about which rooms you enter and to leave earlier when the evidence says to leave, using judgment made outside the room rather than inside it. That is not a diminishment of your nature. It is the correct operating procedure for it. A person with excellent hearing does not learn to hear less. They learn not to stand next to the speaker. The thing you already knew. Underneath every section of this there has been a single fact, and you have known it longer than you have been willing to say it out loud. You knew it was not going to change, not recently, not since the ending. You knew it somewhere around the second year, in a quiet moment, and the knowing arrived complete, and you set it down immediately because picking it up would have required action you were not ready to take. That knowledge sat there the whole time. Every conversation after that point was conducted in its presence. Every explanation was delivered by a person who already understood that explanation would not work, which is why the explanations became increasingly desperate and increasingly precise, because part of you was trying to argue against your own conclusion. You were not talking to them. You were talking to the part of yourself that already knew, trying to keep it from being right. That is why the silence feels like grief rather than victory. It is not the loss of the relationship, which had been over internally for some time. It is the moment you stopped arguing with yourself and let the thing you knew be true. There is nothing more accurate you could have been. You saw it clearly and you held out longer than the evidence warranted, and the holding out was love rather than stupidity, and it ended when it had to end. Now the knowing and the doing are finally aligned. That alignment is what peace actually is. Not the absence of feeling, not the resolution of the story, not the correction of the record. Just the end of the gap between what you know and how you live, the last thing. The title says winning, and the whole thing has been an argument that winning here does not mean what it sounds like, and it is worth landing that properly. You did not defeat them. Nothing in this was a contest and no score was kept, and the idea that there was a competition is itself a residue of a relationship in which you were always slightly on the losing end of something. What you did was stop playing a game that only had one player producing effort. And the reason it looks like winning from the outside and eventually from the inside is that the person who stops carrying something heavy immediately appears stronger than the person who never picked it up, and the comparison flatters you, and the flattery is not the point. The point is much simpler and much better. You spent years saying things into a room that did not answer, and you have stopped, and the stopping has returned to you a very large amount of a very limited resource, which is your own attention, which is the only material any life is actually built from. They will do whatever they do with the quiet that is theirs. What is yours is the sound of your own life, which has been playing underneath all of this for years, at low volume, drowned out by an ongoing conversation with someone who is not participating. It is audible now. You do not have to say anything to hear it.